How's everyone doing? It's always tough to do the last talk before lunch, so we'll make sure we do it right and give you time to take a break. So thank you for coming to Replay. And here in this talk, we are going to sort of continue the talk that started from beginning. I don't know how many of you were in Sergey's talk about high availability. We're going to kind of extend that a little bit to talk about some of the similar concepts, but more focused on how do you practically use and apply all these learnings on Temporal Cloud. We can skip this. So very brief introduction of agenda. We'll talk a little bit about the fundamentals of high availability, talk a little bit about the replication stack in Temporal Cloud, and actually in Temporal, which exists in both the OSS part of Temporal and Temporal Cloud. We'll talk a little bit about our deployment strategies, failure domains, and our failure strategies. And then I'll introduce Nikitha to talk a little about some of our case studies with our customers and our future roadmaps. And at the end, we'll leave around 5 minutes if you have questions. So what makes an application reliable? What do you all think? Like, if you're developing an application, what do you think will make it reliable comparing to another application which fails? Anyone? Seems like you. I'm sorry? Fault tolerance, yes. What else you can think of?
Unexpected things handled gracefully.
Yes, cool. So yeah, I mean, as you all mentioned, it's all about sort of proactively handling all the errors that you can either participate, or if you don't participate, you don't kind of anticipate, then basically you need to handle your incidents, right? So largely your application contains 3 parts, right? Your application code, which is what you write as your business logic. And then your dependencies. It could be a database that you rely on to store your state. It could be a third-party service which you use to fulfill your requirements. It could be some infrastructures, whether it's your own on-prem clusters, services, or a cloud provider, right? And then your operations. Whenever an unexpected error happens, how do you operate? What kind of options you have? And if you look more closely in all these 3 different categories, your application code is something that is fully in your control, right? You write it, you try your best to write your test with it, and you kind of come up with your operational strategies. You can roll forward, roll back your builds, you can do certain operations on it. And for the dependencies, usually it's outside of your control, whether it's a third-party services that you call, whether it is the infrastructure that is provided by a cloud provider, right? Usually we'll rely on them to do all the operations in case you have an incident. And then the set of operations, it will depend. Some of the operations can be performed by you as operator and a service provider, and some of them is out of your control, depending on how you architect your code. And then the second question, obviously, is how do you build a reliable application? Going back to all these 3 things. You have your application code, right? And somehow, the best way we think that you can build your application code is to use event sourcing and to make sure that your application code is re-entrant so that you can either through replace or through retries, you get reliability while you're fixing issues. And then for your dependencies and the services, essentially what you're looking for is some sort of redundancies and isolations between your redundancies, right? If you were in Sergey's earlier talk, you saw that all these houses, and there's a river between these houses, right? What it means is that when one of your houses is on fire, you can go to another house to live. And the river makes sure that when the fire is on one house, it doesn't propagate to the other house, right? To bring down both of them, then it's useless. And then operations, right? And that's basically to make sure that you have a plan to either through replication or certain kind of failovers to allow you to continue your business in a different isolation domain while you're dealing with incidents. And the first part about event sourcing and re-entry encode is already either provided by Temporal as a framework or by your workflow design. And the rest of this is essentially the main topic of this talk. Okay, so at the fundamental of this whole thing is the replication stack and failure domains, right? So let's first talk about replication. Temporal has this application level replication, which allows us to do a lot of things. It allows us to do all the HADR stuffs, which is what we're going to talk about. Also, it allows us to do a lot of the migration stuff, which you've seen a demo in the keynote, right? So fundamentally, what this means is you have different clusters, and you have workflows with states and history events, which are essentially write-ahead logs of these workflows. And the other thing it has is all these T's, which stands for tasks, right? Tasks is which moves these workflows forward between their state transitions. Temporal replication is essentially an active and standby replication. What it means is that your workflow will always be executing in the active cluster. And as your workflow continues to make progress, all the events got added into the history. And as part of that, we also generate tasks. So a set of these tasks are what we call replication tasks, which basically ships all these history events from the active cluster to any of these replication peers, basically the standby clusters. And when these standby clusters see all these replication tasks, it actually learns about all these history events happening from the active side, and it tries to reconstruct the workflow state as it sees all these events. So at the end of the day, what it means is that your standby cluster will have all the workflow changes. And you basically have a hot standby, which allows you to do failover at any given point of time, barring the replication lag. Now, with this in mind, let's take a look at what you can get from Temporal Cloud. The basic thing that you can get is what we call a standard cloud namespace, Temporal Cloud namespace, right? This is when you create your account, you create your namespace without doing any further configurations. This is the default namespace you're going to get. And what is important in this graph is how you think about, or how Temporal Cloud thinks about the failure domain. You have your namespace, which gets deployed into a cell, which basically is a cluster that contains different resources, including the database, including the visibility, including the compute and its own network, right? And this cell basically exists in one of the cloud providers' regions. And then on top of that, you have your workers and your applications, which interacts with your workers. One thing to point out is, even with the standard temporal namespace, on the database side, we already replicate the data across all three different AZs. And from the compute side, we always deploy and distribute all the compute resources in three different availability zones in the cloud provider, which means that by default, even if you don't do any configurations, bringing down the entire AZ is going to be a non-event for you as a customer. So your workflow continue to work, your application will continue to work. And because of that, for a normal namespace, Temporal Cloud will be able to provide you 3 nines of SLAs. However, there's risks associated with this setup, right? So whenever, for example, there's a cloud-wide outage that impacts a particular region, or if there is outage impacting the database that is attached to this particular cluster or cell, then your namespace, if it happens to be deployed to this particular cell, will be impacted. And what it boils down to is you'll probably see higher latencies. Sometimes you will see availability drops, and then Temporal will work with you during these incidents to restore the service. Because there's no additional application level replication, then you will basically will need to wait for Temporal to resolve the incident. Now, with the replication stack, what you can also do is to click a button and then start to replicate across different failure domains. In this setup, we call it high availability with a single endpoint. And the way you think about this setup is that Temporal Cloud still provides you one namespace endpoint. But behind the scenes, this endpoint actually deploys the namespace in two different failure domains with replication. This can be deployed to two different regions and have one DNS that gets failed over as part of the overall namespace failover process, or it can be with the same region replication that we just provide today. And in the same region replication case, you don't even need to switch the namespace endpoint between regions. And from your side, you still have one set of worker and application which talks to the single endpoint. The good news for you now is that whenever there is an incident that impacts that failure domain, Temporal Cloud or you as a customer now get to choose if you want to fail over the namespace to a different failure domain. And whenever that happens, it resolved incident, at least from you as a customer perspective, immediately, right? So you basically can resolve the incident and restore your service at the time that you choose. This also means that contractually, Temporal can provide you 4 nines of SLA. The other thing that we want to mention is that with this setup, you as a developer don't need to change your code at all. And if you choose same region replication, you don't even need to change your deployment strategy. You can continue to work with this single endpoint. The additional risk on this is you still have a single endpoint, so there's still potential single point of failure, right? Imagine you still have one set of workers, so if there's an outage that impacts the region that your worker sits in, then without worker, your application will still experience downtime. Which brings us to this setup where we can provide you a redundancy on endpoints as well. This is basically a setup that you can have today with multi-region namespaces and regional endpoints. And in future, we can do a similar setup with cross-cloud providers. And in this setup, you will also deploy your application stack in different regions so that if any of the temporal services or your applications or your dependencies got impacted in one of the failure domains, you can fail over the stack. And then it will continue to work in a different cluster or failure domain. And with that, I'm going to just introduce Nikitha to talk about our customer story and our future roadmap.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, so I'll just get us started with a case study of a customer who will not be named, one of our telco customers, who were actually heavily on-prem and were upheld to a very high SLA by their own customers. And having to implement this, especially with a homegrown workflow solution that they cobbled together with Kafka, a bunch of custom code, Postgres, meant this was a really challenging problem. Achieving 4 nines of high availability for them actually meant, and this is a direct quote, like several horrific weekends where their team was held accountable for running this platform and making sure it was available. And I think the other challenge that perhaps is nicely abstracted away by Temporal is the fact that they had to coordinate between multiple teams that were responsible for various parts of this homegrown solution. So if you're trying to coordinate a failover, not only are you dealing with technical complexities, you're also coordinating with multiple teams. And definitely a huge drain in terms of resources. The team, they could much better spend their time focusing on their business objectives as opposed to infrastructure and managing this entire setup. And so the status quo after Temporal, really straightforward. Obviously, they had to migrate. But after doing that, I think they were very simply able to add an additional region, a replica in a new region, which just gave them the 4 nines straight out of the box. Really no complexity. They kind of offloaded that to Temporal Cloud. And so, this team's headaches, the weekends, late nights, all gone away. 4 nines of SLA immediately guaranteed that they could also promise to their own customers and automated failovers. So no need to, as Liang just mentioned, workers were still talking to the same endpoint. No application code needed to change. So really straightforward for them. In terms of our features and roadmap, we actually launched the first version of this in 2023 in September at our Replay conference in Seattle. I think Liang did that announcement. I wasn't even at Temporal at the time. But yeah, it was a really exciting time because this kind of technology, it is available actually open source as well. For many of our customers have used global namespaces, are familiar with the feature. But I think the implementation in cloud is just so easy, and we've built a lot of automation in the control plane that helps make this really seamless. We launched public preview earlier last year in May 2024, which further added more functionality, gave it a nice UI. And where we are right now is, as we announced in our keynote, multi-region replication is generally available. We have added support for GCP. Previously, it was AWS only. We also now have fully automated health checks, meaning that we are constantly running performance checks on how our clusters are doing, and we are able to initiate failovers fully automatically. Additional stuff, API key support. I think a lot of customers were asking us for that. Previously, we only supported MTLS with multi-region replication, and now we can support API keys as well. We also have now same region replication, and this was a big ask from customers who basically said, like, the rest of my application stack isn't really multi-region. My database is located in a single region. It's kind of weird that like Temporal Cloud is multi-region available and the rest of my app stack is not. And so if really you don't have a strong use case for being multi-region, then you can get the same 4 nines of SLA by choosing same region replication. And so what we do is we have a separate isolation domain within the single cell that Liang mentioned. So you still get that resiliency without having to go across regions. So for later this year, I think we're really excited about multi-cloud replication. Now that we support both GCP and AWS namespaces, this means you could have a namespace that's replicated across cloud providers for even higher resiliency. Coordinated failovers are also something that we're thinking about. We know you have a lot of application dependencies that also need to be failover, and Temporal is really well placed to be the control plane for those failovers. So that's something we're going to be working on. And then this is far into the future, but you already heard some of this stuff in the context of migration. We'd like to do replication between self-hosted clusters and cloud, meaning you could have a setup where you can fail over from on-prem to cloud or back if that's something that you want to do. Here are just a few screenshots from our UI today, just sharing it in case folks haven't seen it. Really, the idea is to show you how straightforward this is. This is our namespace creation workflow, and really all you're specifying is whether you want to add a replica, and you choose where you want that replica to be. So if you want it to be in the same region, you can choose that. This example is showing a multi-region replica in a different region. This one is this namespace UI itself, which basically shows you the namespace, its replica, which region that replica is located in, and the last time a failover event happened. You can trigger failovers yourself if you wanted to for testing purposes, or if there was something weird that you noticed that Temporal Cloud hadn't caught yet. But like I mentioned, the automated health checks we have in place are intended to monitor service errors, latencies, and we would be able to initiate a failover in most cases. This is the feature that we launched at Replay, so it's fairly new, really even simpler than multi-region because you don't really have to worry about going cross-region. The same region selection is fairly straightforward. You don't need to do anything. Just tell us you want a replica, and we'll create that for you. And the same 4 nines, as I mentioned. All right, a few final thoughts. So I think really what's driving the need for reliability or higher reliability than we offer already with standard temporal namespaces is really depends on your business requirements. We have a lot of customers, and this is kind of, I guess, going against a feature that I would like more people to use, is they just say, like, temporal cloud itself has been so reliable, I don't see why we need more reliability, which is fair. So if you're already getting what you need, we are contractually obligated to 3 nines with every namespace. In practice, and I'm sure many of our cloud customers will attest to this, it's higher than 3 nines most of the time. It's probably already 4. But if you're looking for more of a guarantee, that's where we recommend higher availability with the features that we shared here. It does require careful design and planning. So as I mentioned, a lot of the failovers are automated, which means once you add a region, you should be fully prepared to fail over to that region. We have had some customers who have never triggered a failover and have enabled this feature, which is a risky move. When things go wrong, you don't want to find out for the first time that like something went completely wrong on your worker side. Maybe one of your app dependencies couldn't deal with like going across regions. So we highly recommend having a failover strategy, doing regular failover testing, making sure that everything works. Something that works in staging may fail in production, so do continuous failover testing in production as well. And yeah, so I think just as temporal in general enhances reliability in a single region, our high availability options just give you that extra 9, that extra peace of mind. So yeah, that's basically what we have to share with you today, and we have time now for some questions.
Okay, great. Raise your hands if you have some questions. I'll start here in the middle.
Hi, thanks for that overview. One question I've got, we use high availability for our Aurora cluster in AWS. And one thing that we have to understand relatively well for that is like replication lag, making sure that if we need to fail over, you know, is it actually synced up enough to fail over? Is there a way to monitor that with this functionality?
Yes. Short answer is yes. So Temporal has a set of external metrics which we expose to all our cloud cloud customers. So if you enable multi-region namespace or any of the replicating namespace, then you will see metrics on replication lag.
Okay, and are there any like safeguards in the UI for?
Not directly in the UI. Okay, so safeguards, yes. What it means is when you click the button for failover, it triggers a workflow in the control plane to do it. And a part of the workflow is going to check how bad the replication lag is. Obviously, if you have 5 days of replication lag, we'll just warn you to basically see if you really want to do it. But eventually, it's your choice as a customer because we don't understand what your business logic is and the impact to your service, right? We'll just give you the option, and eventually it's your choice.
Thanks.
I saw a hand over here first. No? Any other questions? Thank you.
Would it be possible to do a region failover using a temporal workflow, or is that a bit too much like Inception?
So the question is, if a region goes down, can that impact the failover workflow? Or?
Oh, no, so what I had in mind was more of a kind of like DR testing strategy. So you can run a workflow which would fail over your region or you know, to another region.
You could do it. I would just make sure it's not in the same namespace so that you have some isolation. And,
Sure. So I think one thing that I want to emphasize is the way that I look at a single region namespace versus a multi-region namespace. A single region namespace is more like a contract between this single temporal endpoint versus whatever you have, applications, infrastructure, everything. As long as we are telling you that this endpoint meets our SLA, then at least from temporal cloud side, we are providing the service. Now, if you look at a multi-region namespace, what it eventually allows you to do is a multi-region application, if you will, right? What it means that it's not just one endpoint, and even though Temporal's endpoint is functional, if you have issues with your dependency in that region and your application is not functional, then I think we missed the goal, right? So from that perspective, what it boils down to, I think 2 points. One is, as we just described, it's a collective design effort to make sure that you can align all the stars so that you can fail this over. What it also means to your question is you don't necessarily need to trigger this in the condition of temporal service going down, right? It's equally important if you have a database and your database replicates and for whatever reason your database is going down, you want to trigger and test that scenario as well. Obviously, from temporal side, we did all the tests from our side, and we, as Nikitha mentioned, we have actually monitoring to look at each individual namespace availability and latencies, and we have automatic failovers when things goes wrong. But on your side, I think the equal exercise needs to be done so that it's fully proven to be sort of working for all these different unexpected errors, as we said in the beginning.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, any
there's
other
a
questions?
There's one.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was just curious, have you ever had an incident where an entire like AWS availability zone has gone down since you've had this feature and you've had to fail over all your cloud customers at the same time?
So let me just clarify a little bit. So as I said, AZ level failure is not going to impact our service. So one region will have multiple AZs, at least more than 3 AZs. So one AZ going down is going to basically be no impact at all to you as a customer. I cannot speak about your workers and how you deploy your workers and all this, but at least from the server perspective, it should work. Now, we do see wider impact of cloud providers in a specific region, especially on the networking side, right? So when those things happen, it will impact a large number of namespaces in that region. And again, so on Temporal Cloud side, we have all the monitors, which are implemented, as you can imagine, using workflows to fail over all the multi-region namespaces that are active in that region, sort of to their corresponding standby regions, if you will. And depending on how you set up, you can see that it could be different regions. Like we're just basically evacuating all the traffic from one region to all the rest of the regions.
But I don't believe we've had to do that yet. Not all of them.
It's very rare event, let's put that
It's a rare event, so that was kind of the reason.
But we have the mechanisms. We actually have testings around all these scenarios.
So how can you be confident that it would run smoothly given it's such a rare event?
So 2 things, right? One is, the good news about replication is it's kind of consumes the same amount of resources. So from capacity planning perspective, even though we are not failing over your namespace, the standby still are provisioned to be able to take over your traffic from both the, starting from the database to all the compute to the networking side of things. And the other side is the testing part. And we do have mechanisms to trigger all these failovers, and it doesn't require us to get an outage to trigger the failover. We still can test the entire like zone and region evacuation workflows even without an outage, and we'll see if it works for us as a cloud provider, so a service provider, and for you as a customer. So that's why we emphasize multiple times the key to this is to plan ahead and to test all the scenarios before you actually hit the incident.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for the great questions. We're out of time. Please give our speakers another warm round of applause.